Right now, somewhere between one breath and the next, a small curtain has come down over your eyes and lifted again, and you didn't see it happen. Not the coming down, not the lifting, not even the brief nothing in between. If you're lying still, letting your eyelids grow heavy the way they naturally do at this hour, it's already happened several times since you started listening to this sentence, and you experienced none of it as darkness. You experienced it as nothing at all, which is a stranger thing than darkness, if you think about it slowly enough, which is exactly what we're going to do. Here is the puzzle, laid out gently, without any rush to solve it. Several times a minute, for your entire waking life, a thin fold of skin has swept down over your eyes, briefly and completely blocking the light from reaching the back of them. This is not a small thing happening at the edges of vision. It is a full and total blackout, however short. The lens goes dark, the signal stops. And yet, if you were to ask most people, right now, whether their view of the world ever cuts to black while they're awake, they would say no, of course not. They'd say the world has been sitting there in front of them, continuously, like a long, unbroken ribbon of seeing, the whole time they've had their eyes open. Both of these things are true. The blackout happens, and the ribbon feels unbroken. That contradiction, sitting quietly at the center of something so ordinary you've done it thousands of times just today, is where we're going to spend the next little while, turning it over slowly, the way you might turn a stone over in your palm, without needing to identify it right away. It helps to start with just how often this is happening, because the number tends to surprise people when they hear it for the first time, even though it's their own body doing it. On average, a person blinks somewhere between 15 and 20 times every minute they're awake. Not 15 or 20 times an hour, 15 or 20 times a minute. Over the course of a single day, that adds up to something in the range of 10,000 to 20,000 blinks, depending on the person, their state of tiredness, what they're doing with their eyes at the time. Reading tends to lower the rate a little. Conversation tends to raise it. But even at the low end, that's an enormous number of individual moments in which the visual world was, for a fraction of a second, entirely unavailable to you. And each of those moments passed by, this morning, this afternoon, this evening leading up to now, completely unnoticed, not ignored, not suppressed with effort, simply not registered as an event at all. Try for a moment to imagine explaining this to someone who had never blinked, if such a person could exist. You would have to tell them, several thousand times today, a flap of tissue is going to physically cover the surface of your eyes, cutting off the image entirely, and you are not going to notice a single one of these occurrences. They might reasonably ask how that's possible. How does a repeated, total interruption of the primary sense most people rely on most heavily simply fail to register? It's a fair question, and it doesn't have a simple one-line answer, which is part of why it's worth sitting with for a while, rather than rushing past it the way we usually do in ordinary life, where there's always something else demanding attention. Part of what makes this worth slowing down for is that it isn't just an odd little quirk tucked away in a corner of human biology. It touches on something much bigger, which is the difference between what is actually happening to your senses, moment by moment, and what you experience as your ongoing awareness of the world. Those two things feel like they should be the same. It feels, from the inside, like your experience of seeing is a direct, unfiltered readout of whatever light happens to be landing on your eyes at any given instant. But the blink shows us, in a small and almost comic way, that this can't quite be right. There is some kind of gap between the raw information arriving at your eyes
and the smooth, continuous sense of seeing that you carry around with you.
Something is happening in that gap. Something is doing quiet work to keep the picture from flickering, work so effective and so well hidden that most people go their entire lives without ever wondering about it. Consider, for a moment, what the equivalent interruption would look like in a different medium, one where we're used to noticing breaks. If you were watching an old film reel, and every so often the projectionist covered the lens with their hand for a fraction of a second, you would see it. You would see the screen go briefly black, then return. Even the friendliest, most immersive film would show you that hiccup, because film doesn't have a mechanism for hiding its own interruptions from the viewer. But your visual experience doesn't work that way. There's no flicker to black. There's no dimming, and then a return. There is, from your point of view, just the room, continuously. The same lamp in the corner, the same shape of the ceiling above you, the same quality of dark or dim light in whatever space you're resting in right now, unbroken. And it's worth being precise about what's strange here, because it would be easy to think the strangeness is simply that blinks are fast. That's part of it, certainly. A single blink takes somewhere in the range of 1/10 of a second to 4/10 of a second, depending on how you measure it and how forceful the blink is. That's genuinely brief. But brief is not the same as invisible. There are other things that happen just as quickly, or nearly so, that we do notice. A camera flash going off in a dark room, a light switch flicking on and off rapidly. These are also over in a fraction of a second, and yet they register vividly, sometimes leaving a little afterimage behind, a ghost of brightness floating in your vision for a moment after the light itself is gone. So speed alone doesn't explain why the blink disappears from awareness, while other brief visual events do not. There has to be something more specific going on, something about the particular circumstances of a blink that makes it different from a flash of light or a sudden shadow. This is the kind of question that doesn't resolve itself the moment you ask it, and that's fine. It's not meant to. Some questions are worth holding loosely for a while, letting them sit in the back of the mind the way you might let a piece of music sit there after it's finished playing, still faintly present, not urgent, just there. Over the course of this narration, we're going to walk through this puzzle slowly, piece by piece, looking at what the eye is actually doing during a blink, what the brain is doing with the information it does and doesn't receive, and how the sense of a continuous, unbroken world gets constructed from input that is, if you look closely enough, considerably more broken and patchy than it feels. None of this needs to be rushed. There's no test at the end, no need to hold every detail in place. You can let pieces of this drift in and out, the way your attention naturally drifts as the evening goes on, without losing the thread of the larger idea, which is really just this. Your experience of the world is smoother than the world itself has any obligation to be, and there is something quietly remarkable and quietly comforting in how that smoothing happens without your ever having to think about it. For now, it's enough to simply notice the shape of the paradox and let it settle. Thousands of tiny blackouts a day, invisible every single time, sitting underneath a feeling of unbroken continuity that you've trusted, without question, for your entire life. Somewhere in your body right now, that curtain is still coming down and lifting again, over and over, patient and unremarked upon, keeping its own rhythm, regardless of whether you're paying attention to it. And before we look at why it disappears so completely from awareness, it helps to first get a clearer picture of what the eyelid itself is actually doing down there, in that small stretch of tissue that spends so much of your life in motion without ever once asking for credit. Let's start close in, at the level of tissue and motion, because the eyelid is a stranger piece of anatomy than most people ever stop to consider. It's easy to think of it as a simple flap, a kind of window shade, something that just drops and rises on a track, but the movement is more athletic than that. The upper eyelid is pulled open by a muscle called the levator palpebrae superioris, a name that sounds far more complicated than the job it does, which is simply to lift. And when a blink happens, that muscle briefly relaxes, while another one, the orbicularis oculi, a ring of muscle circling the eye like a loose drawstring, contracts and pulls the lid down and closed. Then, almost immediately, the levator takes back over and the lid rises again, down and up, a tiny piece of choreography, performed by muscles most people couldn't name, executed somewhere between 15 and 20 times a minute, hour after hour, for an entire lifetime, without rehearsal and without fail. What's worth sitting with for a moment is the speed of it, a single blink, the kind that happens on its own, without you deciding anything, takes somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/10 of a second to 1/3 of a second, depending on the person and the moment. That's the whole event, start to finish, the lid coming down, making contact, and lifting away again. To put that in some kind of context, it's quicker than the time it takes to say the word blink itself. And yet inside that sliver of time, several distinct things are happening in careful sequence, not as one blurred motion but as a small procedure, layered and specific, the way a skilled hand might perform several small steps in what looks to an outside observer like a single fluid gesture. The most obvious job the eyelid is doing is mechanical. It's a wiper. Every time it closes, it drags a thin sheet of fluid across the surface of the eye, smoothing out whatever has gathered there, whatever dust has drifted in, whatever has begun to dry. This fluid is usually just called tears, which is a slightly misleading word because it makes people think only of crying, of overflow, of something emotional and occasional. But the tear film that coats the eye during an ordinary blink is doing something much quieter and much more constant. It's not an event, it's maintenance. And it's built, if you look closely, not as one uniform layer, but as 3 distinct ones, stacked on top of each other, like the layers of a fine finish on wood, each with its own job, each depending on the others to hold together. Closest to the eye itself is a layer made mostly of mucus, thin and clingy, whose job is to help the watery layer above it actually stick to the surface of the eye, rather than beading up and sliding off, the way water beads on a freshly waxed car. Above that sits the watery layer itself, the bulk of the tear film, produced continuously by the lacrimal gland, tucked up near the outer corner of the eye socket, above eye level, which is why tears, that overflow, tend to run down and toward the nose, rather than straight down the cheek. And on top of everything, forming the outermost surface, is a layer of oil, produced by small glands, along the edge of the eyelid, called the meibomian glands, whose entire purpose seems to be slowing evaporation, keeping that thin watery layer from simply drying away into the air, the way a puddle disappears on a warm afternoon. Every blink spreads this 3-part structure fresh across the eye, smooths out any thin spots, and helps push the used, slightly warmed fluid toward the inner corner, where it drains through 2, almost impossibly small openings, and eventually finds its way down into the nasal cavity, which, incidentally, is the real reason crying tends to come with a runny nose. The system was never separate to begin with. None of this is decorative. The cornea, that clear dome at the very front of the eye, the part light passes through before it ever reaches the lens or the retina, has no blood vessels running through it.
That's part of what keeps it transparent, since blood vessels would scatter light and cloud the view. But it also means the cornea can't rely on blood the way most tissue does, to bring in oxygen and to keep the surface properly conditioned. Instead, it depends heavily on that tear film sitting on top of it, and on the oxygen dissolved directly into that film from the surrounding air. Without regular blinking, the surface of the cornea would begin to dry in patches, unevenly, and an uneven corneal surface doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it actually changes how light bends as it enters the eye, however slightly. So in a very literal sense, blinking isn't just protecting the eye, it's continuously repolishing the very lens system your entire visual world depends on, keeping the front surface of your sight optically even, over and over, without you ever being asked to supervise the process. It helps here to separate two kinds of blinks that get lumped together in ordinary conversation, but are, physiologically, doing somewhat different work. There's the reflex blink, the fast, sharp closure, triggered by something arriving at the eye uninvited, a puff of air, a gust of dust off a sidewalk, a finger moving too close, too fast. That kind of blink is defensive, almost startled, wired through pathways that don't wait for conscious permission, because waiting would defeat the purpose. And then there's the spontaneous blink, the one this narration is really circling around, the kind that isn't a response to anything happening in the outside world at all. It isn't triggered by dryness in any simple sense, and it isn't a reaction to a threat. It seems to be generated from within, on something like an internal schedule, arising out of activity deep in the brain, even when the eye itself is, at that exact moment, perfectly comfortable, and in no particular need of wiping. It's the blink that happens while you're listening to someone talk, or staring at a wall, or lying in the dark with your eyes not fully closed, thinking about nothing in particular. That's the one that will occupy most of this narration, because it turns out to be tangled up with far more than eye care. But before going further into what that spontaneous rhythm might be doing, it's worth pausing on something simple and easy to overlook, which is that the interruption itself is not a metaphor. When the eyelid closes, even for that fraction of a second, it isn't a symbolic gesture toward darkness, or a loose way of speaking. It is, physically and optically, a shutter closing over a lens. Light that would otherwise be landing on your retina is blocked, fully and completely, by a few layers of skin and muscle and eyelash, in exactly the same way it would be blocked by a hand passed quickly in front of your face, or a curtain drawn briefly across a window and pulled open again. The retina, the layer of light-sensitive tissue at the back of the eye, quite literally, is not receiving any visual information during that interval. Nothing about that darkness is figurative. It is a true gap in the incoming signal, an actual pause in the stream of light that your visual system depends on to build its picture of the world, no different in kind from someone briefly switching off a lamp in an otherwise lit room. And this is really the seed of the whole puzzle worth turning over slowly tonight. If the darkness is real, if the shutter is genuinely closing and genuinely blocking light, then the world in front of you should, by any straightforward account of how vision works, be flickering constantly, going dark, coming back, dark again, back again, all day, thousands of times, a strobe you'd think would be impossible to ignore. And yet it isn't. You've likely never noticed even one of these blackouts happening to you in ordinary life. Not today, not yesterday, not across the whole span of years you've had eyes that blink. That absence of noticing is not a flaw in your attention. It's not you failing to pay close enough attention to your own experience. It's the product of something the brain is doing, quietly and continuously, to the raw material your eyes are handing it, and that's where we're headed next, into what happens on the other side of the optic nerve once that shutter closes.
Let's slow down for a moment and just count. Actual numbers, nothing exotic, the kind of arithmetic you could do on your fingers if you weren't lying still with your eyes closed right now. A single human blink, measured carefully under laboratory conditions, takes somewhere between 100 and 400 milliseconds from the moment the eyelid starts to descend to the moment it's fully open again. Call it an average of a third of a second for an ordinary blink, a little longer if you're tired, a little shorter if you're startled, and a typical waking adult blinks somewhere around 15 to 20 times every minute, though that number swings quite a bit depending on what you're doing. Reading tends to suppress blinking, so does staring at a screen, which is part of why your eyes feel dry after an afternoon of it. Conversation speeds blinking up, so does anxiety, but 15 to 20 a minute is a reasonable resting average for someone going about an ordinary day. Multiply that out, and the picture starts to take shape. 15 blinks a minute, each one costing a third of a second, comes to about 5 seconds of blocked light every minute. Stretch that across an hour, and you're looking at roughly 5 minutes of true, physical darkness, hidden inside 60 minutes of what felt like continuous, unbroken seeing. Stretch it further, across a 16-hour waking day, and the number climbs to somewhere in the neighborhood of an hour and 20 minutes. A little more if you're anxious or the room is dry, a little less if you're deep in a book. Repeat that across a year, and you arrive at something that sounds almost implausible when you first hear it stated plainly: several hundred hours of your annual waking life, spent with your retina receiving no light at all, and yet folded so seamlessly into experience that you would swear, if asked, that you'd seen everything continuously. Some careful estimates, tallying blink time across a full lifetime of ordinary waking hours, land in the range of a year or more of total eyes closed time, distributed in slivers too small to ever register as an event. Not a year of sleep, a year of blinking, a year of the world being switched off and switched back on, 1/3 of a second at a time, while you went about the business of living as though nothing had happened. Now, the tempting move at this point, and it's a genuinely reasonable one, is to reach for an explanation you may have already half formed on your own, which is that this is simply persistence of vision doing its job. The idea has a long and interesting history. It was Peter Marc Roget, the same physician and scholar who would later spend his retirement compiling the thesaurus that still carries his name, who in the 1820s wrote a paper on the persistence of visual impressions and how it might explain why a spinning wheel looks like a solid disc, why the spokes blur into a shimmer rather than reading as separate lines. The underlying observation is sound enough. Your visual system does not process light instantaneously and then discard it the moment it's gone. There's a kind of afterglow, a brief trailing persistence in the neural response, so that when one image is swapped for another quickly enough, the eye and brain smooth the transition rather than registering a hard cut. It's the same basic principle that lets a strip of still photographs run through a projector fast enough, read as smooth continuous motion instead of a slideshow. Early filmmakers leaned on exactly this, and so, in a sense, does every screen you look at today, refreshing itself dozens of times a second in a flicker too fast for you to catch. So it's tempting to just stop there and say, well, that explains blinking too. The image lingers, the gap gets papered over, case closed, go to sleep. And it's not a wrong idea, it's just not sufficient on its own to account for the whole effect, and it's worth sitting with why for a moment, because the reasoning is genuinely interesting. Here's the trouble. Persistence of vision, in the classic sense Roget was describing,
works well for brief interruptions, on the order of the flicker rate of old film, or the redraw of a screen, gaps measured in a handful of milliseconds. A blink is considerably longer than that. A third of a second is not nothing, perceptually speaking. It's long enough that if you deliberately closed your eyes for that same span of time, in some other context, say while sitting quietly with a book open in your lap, you would absolutely notice it. You would feel the darkness arrive. There's no version of persistence of vision, as it's classically defined, that's strong enough to paper over 300 or 400 milliseconds of missing input without you ever catching the scene. If simple afterglow were the whole story, blinking would feel like a very fast, repeated flick of a light switch, dim and quick, rather than invisible, the way a strobe at a dance hall still reads as a strobe, even though each flash and each gap between flashes is brief. There's a further problem, too, which is that persistence of vision, on its own, doesn't actually explain darkness disappearing at all. It explains images lingering. It explains why a bright object seems to leave a faint trailing ghost of itself for a fraction of a second after it's gone, the way a sparkler traced through the night air seems to draw a line of light rather than a single point. But a blink isn't swapping one image for another and letting the first one's afterglow bridge the gap. A blink is subtracting the image altogether and putting nothing there in its place. A true absence, not a competing signal. Afterglow can smooth over a transition between two things. It's much less suited to concealing the appearance of nothing at all, especially when that nothing lasts as long as a blink does. So whatever is happening when you fail to notice your own blinks, it has to be doing more work than simple persistence of vision was ever built to do. It has to be actively involved, not just passively letting an old image fade out gently at its own pace.
Which brings us to a distinction that turns out to matter a great deal here, one that's easy to blur together, but genuinely isn't the same thing twice over. There is a difference between the retina going dark, which is a simple, measurable, physical fact about photons being blocked from reaching light-sensitive tissue, and a dark event being consciously represented, which is a much more demanding claim about what actually reaches your awareness, what gets assembled into the picture you'd describe if someone asked you what you just saw. The retina genuinely does go dark during a blink. That much is settled, uncontroversial, and easy to verify with recording equipment. But going dark at the retina is not automatically the same as experiencing darkness. Those are two different stages in a much longer chain, and an enormous amount turns out to happen between the first stage and the second. Think of it a little like a security camera feed being watched by a guard who only glances at the monitor once every so often, rather than staring at it every single second. If a car passes briefly in front of the lens and casts a half-second shadow across the frame, the camera dutifully records that shadow. It's genuinely there in the raw footage, sitting in the data exactly as it happened. But if the guard doesn't happen to be looking during the exact half-second the shadow crosses the screen, that dip never reaches the part of the system that's actually forming a judgment about what was seen. The recording has the gap. The guard's understanding of the scene doesn't. Something quite similar, though considerably more elaborate and far more actively managed, appears to be happening between your retina and your conscious visual experience, and untangling how that management works, what exactly the brain is doing in that third of a second, rather than simply failing to notice it, is where this exploration goes next. Let's follow that signal then, from the moment light stops arriving to the moment awareness would have noticed, if it were going to notice at all. It begins in the retina itself, where photoreceptors, The rods and cones that first catch incoming light convert photons into small electrical changes. Those changes pass through a short relay of retinal cells before leaving the eye altogether, traveling down the optic nerve as trains of electrical pulses. This is worth sitting with for a moment, slowly, because it's easy to imagine vision as something that happens at the eye, the way a photograph happens at the shutter. It doesn't. The eye is closer to a microphone than a finished recording. It picks up a signal and sends it onward, and everything interesting about what you actually end up seeing happens further down the line, in tissue that isn't shaped like an eye at all. The optic nerve carries that signal toward a small paired structure deep in the middle of the brain called the thalamus, specifically a part of it known as the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is a name you don't need to hold on to, though the role it plays is worth understanding. For a long time, the thalamus was thought of as a fairly passive relay station, something like a train platform where signals simply changed cars on their way to the cortex, the outer, folded layer of the brain where richer processing happens. That picture has shifted quite a bit over the past few decades. The thalamus, it turns out, is not just a platform. It behaves more like a checkpoint with its own judgment, capable of amplifying some signals, damping others, and adjusting how easily information is allowed to pass through, depending on what else is going on in the brain at that moment. And one of the things that changes what passes through that checkpoint, researchers have found, is the act of blinking itself. Here is the part that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it described slowly, without rushing past it. The reduction in visual sensitivity connected to a blink does not begin only once the eyelid has finished closing and the retina has actually gone dark. It begins earlier than that, tracking backward toward the very start of the blink, sometimes even into the brief window just before the lid starts its downward movement at all. Researchers using brain imaging during blinking have found reduced activity in visual processing areas that starts before the eyes are even fully shut, which means the nervous system isn't simply reacting to an interruption after the fact. It appears to be anticipating one, adjusting itself in advance, the way a seasoned commuter might start bracing for a subway car's lurch a half-second before the train actually jolts, because years of experience have taught the body roughly when to expect it. That distinction between reacting and anticipating is a meaningful one, and it's worth turning over gently a few times before moving on, the way you might turn a smooth stone over in your palm just to feel each side of it. A purely reactive system would wait for the darkness to arrive at the retina, register that darkness as it traveled up the visual pathway, and then, somewhere further along, decide what to do about it. An anticipatory system behaves differently. It has, in some functional sense, learned the rhythm of its own blinking, learned roughly how long a blink tends to last, and roughly what kind of visual disruption is coming, and it uses that learned rhythm to start damping sensitivity slightly ahead of the actual event. Not because it has consciously predicted anything, in the way you might predict rain from a darkening sky, but because the motor act of blinking and the sensory adjustment around it appear to be tied together at a level far below conscious planning, coordinated the way your breathing adjusts slightly before you stand up from a chair, without your ever deciding to make that adjustment on purpose. This is sometimes described using the term corollary discharge, though you don't need to remember the term itself so much as the idea sitting underneath it, which is genuinely lovely once it settles in. When your brain sends a motor command out to the muscles that close your eyelid, it doesn't only send that command outward toward the muscle, it also appears to send a kind of internal copy, a heads up if you like, to the sensory areas that are about to be affected by the consequences of that very command. It's a little like a stagehand who, moments before pulling a curtain closed, quietly taps the lighting technician on the shoulder first, letting them know a change is coming so they aren't caught off guard by the sudden shift and don't waste effort responding to it as though it were something unexpected happening out in the world. The visual system, in this sense, is told in advance, in its own quiet internal language, that the coming dip in light is self-generated, not a signal from the outside world that needs urgent interpreting. And that self-generated label appears to matter enormously for what happens next, because the brain treats self-caused disruptions rather differently than it treats disruptions arriving from outside. Think about how differently it feels to tickle your own palm compared to having someone else tickle it. How much duller and less startling your own touch feels, even though the physical sensation on the skin is nearly identical either way. That difference isn't happening at the skin. It's happening in how the brain interprets a touch it caused itself versus a touch that arrived unexpectedly, using exactly this kind of internal forecasting to quiet its own reaction to self-generated events. Something structurally similar seems to be at work with blinking. Because the darkening is self-caused, expected, and already accounted for by an internal copy of the command that triggered it, the visual system doesn't treat it the way it would treat, say, someone abruptly switching off a light in the room without warning. It has already been told, in its own quiet way, that this particular darkness doesn't need investigating. This is where the reduction in neural sensitivity starts to make a different kind of sense than simply the eye going dark and the brain passively noticing. Sensitivity in the visual pathway isn't a fixed dial that only responds to how much light is currently arriving. It's a dial the brain actively turns, moment to moment, based on what it expects and what it currently cares about attending to. And during a blink, that dial appears to be turned down, somewhat deliberately, in coordination with the motor command to close the eyelid, rather than being turned down as a delayed consequence of darkness that has already arrived. The timing evidence is part of what makes this so persuasive. If the sensitivity reduction only started once the retina went dark, you'd expect it to align neatly with the moment the eyelid finished closing. Instead, the changes in the visual pathway tend to begin slightly before that, drifting earlier, in a way that fits an anticipatory system rather than a purely reactive one. It helps here to picture the visual pathway not as a single wire carrying a signal from the eye to some final viewing screen in the head, but as a longer relay, a sequence of stations, each one capable of adjusting what it passes along to the next. Light enters the eye and becomes an electrical pattern in the retina. That pattern travels to the thalamus, where it can be dampened or allowed through, depending on what the brain currently expects and needs. What survives that checkpoint then travels onward into the cortex, where much more elaborate processing happens, comparing incoming information against very recent memory, filling gaps, building the continuous, seamless impression you'd describe if someone asked what you were looking at. A blink, on this picture, isn't a single dramatic interruption striking the whole system all at once, the way a power cut might strike an entire building. It's a coordinated, staged adjustment moving through several stations in sequence, timed with unusual precision, most of it completed and folded neatly into ordinary experience before you would ever have had the chance to notice anything had happened at all. Now let's turn to something that happens far more often than blinking. Something so frequent that if it worked the way a blink works, you would spend your entire waking life aware of it. Your eyes are almost never still. Even now, if you were reading rather than listening, they would be jumping, tiny rapid flicks called saccades, several times a second, all day, every day you've ever lived. And each of those jumps carries a hidden problem that is, in some ways, even stranger than the one blinking presents. Think about what a saccade actually does to the image falling on your retina. Your eye isn't gliding smoothly from one point to another the way a camera might pan across a room. It's snapping, almost instantly, the fastest movement the human body is capable of producing. And during that snap, the entire visual world is sweeping across your retina at tremendous speed. If you tried to replicate that motion with a video camera, whipping it rapidly from one side of a room to the other, the footage would come out as a smear, a blur of streaked color and light, unwatchable, disorienting. By any reasonable expectation, that's what your visual experience should include too. Dozens of small, blurry smears stitched into your day, one every time your eyes dart from a word to the next word, from a face to a coffee cup, from one part of a room to another. But you don't experience that. You've likely never experienced that, not once, not even for a fraction of a second that you can recall. The world holds still. It doesn't streak. It doesn't blur. You look at one thing, then you look at another thing, and in between there is nothing. No smear, no gap you'd think to describe, just a clean cut from one steady view to the next, as if your eyes had never moved at all. This is called saccadic suppression, and for a long time, scientists studying it recognized something curious. It looks a great deal like blink suppression, even though the two events seem, on the surface, to have almost nothing in common. A blink closes a curtain over the eye. A saccade doesn't close anything. The eye stays open throughout. Light keeps pouring in the entire time the eye is moving. There's no lid, no darkness, no physical barrier interrupting the supply of visual information the way there is during a blink. And yet the brain suppresses awareness of that period all the same, and does so with a timing precision that echoes what happens during blinking almost exactly. Researchers studying eye movement in the mid-20th century, including work associated with the vision scientist Robert Volkmann in the 1960s, tested this directly, in a way that's worth sitting with for a moment because of how cleverly it isolates the question. If you simply ask someone whether they see a blur during their own saccades, you haven't learned much, because the very thing you're asking about might be exactly what's being suppressed. So instead, researchers arranged for a brief flash of light to be delivered to a person's eye precisely during a saccade, a flash bright enough that it would easily be noticed if delivered at any other moment, and they found that sensitivity to that flash dropped sharply right around the time of the eye movement. A stimulus that would ordinarily register clearly became much harder to detect, sometimes not detected at all, specifically because it arrived while the eyes were in motion. The suppression wasn't a story people were telling themselves after the fact to explain away a blur they hadn't really examined closely. It was a measurable dip in visual sensitivity, present even for information that had nothing to do with the moving image itself. What makes this especially interesting is that the smear a saccade would produce is, if anything, harder to hide than the darkness a blink produces. A blink is a fairly clean event. Cover the eye, sensitivity drops, uncover the eye, sensitivity returns, and the eyelid conveniently does most of the physical work of blocking the image, regardless of what the brain does with it. A saccade offers no such convenient cover. The retina is exposed and active throughout. Whatever the brain is doing to keep that motion-blurred period from reaching your awareness,
It has to do it purely through internal suppression, without any help from a closing lid. It has to somehow persuade the rest of the visual system to disregard perfectly real, perfectly available information streaming in from the retina, moment by moment, for the roughly 20 to 100 milliseconds a typical saccade takes to complete. And the way it manages this appears to draw on the same underlying strategy as blink suppression, even though the two movements are produced by entirely different muscles and controlled by different motor commands. In both cases, the suppression seems to begin in anticipation of the movement, rather than purely as a reaction to it. Just as the visual pathway starts dampening its own signal slightly before the eyelid finishes closing during a blink, there's evidence that sensitivity to incoming visual information begins dropping in the brief interval just before a saccade even starts, before the eye has moved at all. That timing detail matters enormously, because it tells you this isn't the visual system simply getting overwhelmed by too much motion and giving up on processing it accurately. It's the visual system being warned in advance, the way a stagehand might be told a set change is coming a beat before the curtain drops, so that everything can be prepared and positioned in time. Where does that advance warning come from? This is one of the more elegant discoveries in this whole area of research, and it connects saccades and blinks in a way that feels almost architecturally satisfying once you see it. Whenever your brain sends a motor command telling your eye muscles to execute a saccade, it doesn't only send that command outward to the muscles that will actually do the moving, it also sends a copy of that same command sideways, internally, to the parts of the brain responsible for interpreting vision.
Physiologists sometimes call this a corollary discharge, or an efference copy, and the idea, first proposed in different forms by scientists, including Hermann von Helmholtz, in the 19th century, and refined considerably since, is that the brain keeps itself informed about its own intentions. It doesn't just issue commands to the body and then passively wait to see what sensory consequences roll in afterward. It tells its own perceptual systems, in advance, what it's about to do, so those systems can distinguish between changes in the world caused by something out there and changes caused by the brain's own actions. This distinction turns out to be the real key to understanding both blinking and saccades, and possibly the deepest thread connecting them. Picture the difference between someone suddenly switching off the lights in a room while you're sitting there, and you yourself closing your eyes on purpose. Physically, at the level of what happens to your retina, these might look fairly similar, a sudden drop in available light. But they mean completely different things, and your brain seems to know that, seems to have known it long before anyone wrote papers about corollary discharge or efference copies. An external blackout is informative. It might mean danger. It might mean something in the environment has genuinely changed, and a system that ignored it would be a system poorly suited to keeping you safe. A self-caused interruption, by contrast, tells you nothing new about the world at all. You already know you're the one who closed your eyes, or moved them. There's no mystery to solve, no threat to evaluate, nothing worth spending precious attention on. So the brain appears to treat these two categories differently, at a fairly fundamental level, almost as though it keeps a running ledger of which sensory changes were self-initiated and which weren't, and quietly discounts the ones it already expected because it caused them itself. A blink and a saccade both fall into that self-initiated category. Both come with advance notice, generated internally before the movement even occurs, and in both cases, that advance notice
seems to be exactly what allows the brain to smooth over the interruption so completely that most people go their whole lives never noticing, several times a second, that anything happened at all.
Let's slow down here and sit with a slightly different question, one that doesn't ask what the brain ignores, but asks what the brain keeps. Because so far we've talked mostly about discounting, about the mind waving away a signal it already expected. That's true, as far as it goes. But it isn't the whole story, and the rest of the story is, if anything, more useful for settling into sleep, because it has to do with prediction, with the quiet, constant work your brain does guessing what comes next before it arrives. Think about a stone skipping across the surface of a pond. It touches down, lifts off, touches down again, and in between each contact with the water, it isn't really gone, isn't erased from the scene, it's simply following a path that anyone watching can continue to trace, even while the stone itself is briefly airborne. Nobody watching a skipping stone experiences a series of disconnected stone appearances. They see one stone moving continuously, even through the parts of its journey where it isn't touching anything you could call visible contact. The eye, or rather, the mind behind the eye, fills the gap not with more visual information, because there isn't any to be had in that instant, but with a kind of confident continuation, a sense that the object obeys rules, and that those rules can be trusted to hold even when observation briefly lapses. Something like this seems to happen every time you blink. Before your eyelid comes down, your visual system has already been building, moment to moment, a kind of working sketch of the room you're in, not a photograph, something closer to a hypothesis, held loosely, updated constantly. The armchair is still there, low and green, its worn left arm angled toward the window. The window itself is still letting in the same soft gray light it was letting in a second ago. The floor is still ordinary floor, the kind that doesn't do anything, doesn't jump up when you're not watching it. This sketch isn't idle. It's doing active work, actually predicting, with a kind of quiet confidence, what the next fraction of a second will look like, because in a stable, ordinary room, on a stable, ordinary evening, the next fraction of a second usually looks almost exactly like the one before it. So when the eyelid closes, and then opens again a tenth of a second later, the brain isn't left scrambling to rebuild the room from nothing. It already has a very good guess sitting there waiting, and it simply checks that guess against the new incoming light. Does the armchair still look like the armchair? Does the window still look like the window? If yes, and it almost always is yes, because rooms in general are wonderfully unhurried places that rarely rearrange themselves in tenths of a second, then the brain doesn't need to do very much at all. It confirms, it settles, it moves on. There's no dramatic reconstruction happening, no elaborate animation being drawn frame by frame to paper over the missing moment. There's just a prediction, quietly proven right, and a mind that trusts its own prediction enough not to bother examining it too closely. This idea has a name in the scientific literature, though the name matters far less right now than the feeling of it. Researchers sometimes describe the brain as a prediction machine, something that spends most of its energy not passively absorbing the world, but actively guessing at it, moment after moment, and then adjusting only when a guess turns out to be wrong. It's a way of thinking about perception that flips the more old-fashioned picture on its head. The older picture had the eyes as cameras, dutifully recording, and the brain as a kind of editor, stitching the footage together afterward. The newer picture, still being worked out in careful, contested detail by people who study this for a living, treats the brain instead as something more like a forecaster, someone who has looked at the sky so many times
that they can tell you what it will probably do in the next 10 minutes, and only really looks up to check when something in the air changes in a way they weren't expecting. You've probably felt a milder version of this yourself, outside of anything to do with blinking. Think of a familiar hallway in your own home, walked at night, half asleep, lights off. You don't actually see very much. And yet you don't bump into things, not usually, because your feet and your outstretched hand are moving through a hallway that exists almost as vividly in memory and expectation as it would in daylight. You know where the door frame is. You know the floor dips slightly near the kitchen. Your steps are guided less by what your eyes are gathering in that dark moment, and more by what your mind already believes to be true about a space it has walked 1,000 times before. Blinking works on a smaller version of that same principle, just compressed into 1/10 of a second instead of a walk down a hallway, and applied to nearly everything in your field of view, rather than just a floor and a door frame. Now, it's worth being careful here, because this isn't the same as saying the brain invents a rich, fully detailed picture and paints it in for you like a set decorator sneaking onto a stage between scenes. That would actually be a great deal of unnecessary work, and brains, for all their complexity, seem to be fairly economical, at least when economy will do the job. Instead, what seems to happen is closer to a kind of low-resolution trust. The brain doesn't need to imagine every fiber of the carpet, or the exact fold in a curtain during the blink. It only needs to hold on to the general shape of things, the gist, the layout, the sense that nothing important has moved. Vision scientists sometimes talk about this using the word gist, meaning the coarse, quickly grasped sense of a scene, its overall structure and mood and arrangement, as distinct from its fine detail. You can recognize a kitchen as a kitchen in a fraction of a second, long before you could describe the pattern on the tile, or count the items on the counter. That gist, that fast, coarse impression, seems to be exactly what carries through a blink most easily, while the fine detail is allowed to lapse and then quietly get rechecked once the eyes reopen.
There's a nice piece of supporting evidence for this, drawn from an odd kind of experiment vision researchers sometimes run, where they change something in a scene at the exact moment a person blinks, or the exact moment their eyes make a saccade, and see whether the person notices. Often, they don't. Move a coffee cup a few inches while someone's eyes are shut for their blink, and there's a real chance they won't catch it, not because their vision is poor, but because their brain had no particular reason to expect the cup to move, checked only loosely against its own prediction, found nothing alarmingly different at the coarse level, and let the small discrepancy slide by unnoticed. Change something larger, though, something that violates the gist rather than just a fine detail. Swap the room's lighting from warm to cold, say, and people tend to catch it far more reliably, because that kind of change breaks the loose prediction rather than merely disagreeing with it in some small technical way. This tells us something gentle and reassuring about how perception actually works, something worth carrying with you as your own eyes get heavier. You are not, in this very moment, building the world around you fresh, every 1/7 of a second, out of raw visual material. You're mostly confirming a world you already, quietly, expect to be there. The walls of the room you're in are staying where you left them. The ceiling above you is not rearranging itself in the dark. Your body already knows the shape of the bed beneath it, the weight of the blanket, the particular way the pillow gives under your head, and none of that needs to be rebuilt, moment to moment, from scratch. It only needs, every so often, a light, unhurried check, a glance that confirms what was already assumed, and then permission to rest a little further into that assumption. And this brings us to a related question, one that sits just underneath the idea of prediction itself.
If the brain is constantly guessing what comes next, based on what came before, then it must be relying, in some fairly deep way, on the notion that objects in the world don't simply vanish and reappear at random. That a chair, once seen, continues to exist as a chair, even during the moments nobody happens to be looking at it.
There's a related puzzle worth sitting with now, one that has less to do with objects staying put and more to do with a strange kind of accounting the brain performs almost every waking second. Somewhere in the machinery that lets you feel like a continuous person moving through a continuous day, there's a quiet decision being made over and over about which moments get to count as moments at all. Not every flicker of sensation earns a place in the record. Most of them don't. And the line between what gets kept and what gets discarded turns out to depend less on how much light hit your eyes and more on something closer to relevance, on whether the brain judged, in that instant, that this particular sliver of experience was worth holding on to. Think about the last time you drove somewhere familiar, maybe a route you've taken so many times your hands know the turns before your mind fully catches up. There's a very ordinary and very strange experience that happens on drives like that, where you arrive at your destination and realize you don't actually remember several minutes of the trip. Not because you were unconscious, not because your eyes were closed, but because your attention was elsewhere, tuned to a conversation, a song, a thought about dinner, while some other, quieter part of you handled the actual driving. The road was there. Your eyes were open the entire time. Light was landing on your retinas in the usual way, and your brain was almost certainly making the usual predictions and comparisons we've been talking about, catching the coarse shape of the road, noticing when a car ahead slowed down, doing all the background work that keeps you safely in your lane. And yet, if someone asked you afterward to describe what you passed, you might come up empty. Not because it wasn't seen, but because it wasn't stored as something you'd need to retrieve. This is the piece that matters for understanding why a blink disappears so completely from your sense of the day, while other gaps, other missing slivers of time, announce themselves loudly. It isn't only about how much visual information was lost, though that plays a role. It's about whether the brain, in its constant background triage, decided this particular gap deserved a tag, a little flag that says, "Remember this, something happened here." A blink almost never earns that flag. It's brief, it's expected, it's self-caused, and nothing about it violates any prediction the brain was holding. So it slips by unmarked, the same way the hum of a refrigerator slips by unmarked, present in the sound reaching your ears the whole time, but never rising to the level of something your attention bothers to log. There's an old distinction, one that researchers studying attention and memory have leaned on for decades, between sensing something and actually experiencing it in the fuller sense, the sense that leaves a trace you can later report on. The eye can register a shape, a color, a flicker of motion, without that registration ever crossing the threshold into what gets called working memory, the small, busy workspace where information sits available for a few seconds, ready to be used, compared, or acted on. A great deal of what lands on your retina every waking moment never makes that crossing. It arrives, does its small job of updating some prediction somewhere, and then is let go, the way a librarian might glance at a book someone's returning, note that it's the right book, in reasonably good condition, and set it back on the shelf without ever really reading a page of it. The glance was real, it happened, but it isn't the same as reading,
and it doesn't leave the same kind of memory behind. A blink lives almost entirely in that first category, sensed, briefly, and then released, because nothing about it demanded further attention. This is part of why, when people are asked directly, in a laboratory setting, whether they noticed anything strange while reading or watching something on a screen, they very often say no, even when researchers know, from tracking the muscles around the eyes, that blinks were happening at their normal rate the entire time. The blinks weren't hidden from the visual system, they were simply not judged worth carrying forward. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and where the story starts to explain something you may have noticed yourself, without ever quite putting words to it. If you're sitting in a dim room, and the light flickers, just a fraction of a second, an eye blink's worth of darkness, but caused by something outside your body, rather than the ordinary muscular motion of your own eyelids, you notice. Almost every time, even though the duration might be nearly identical to a blink, even though the amount of visual information lost might be comparable, the brain treats it entirely differently. It gets flagged. It becomes an event, something you'd mention to whoever else is in the room with you, something that might make you glance up at the light fixture, something that lingers, at least briefly, as a small question mark in your evening. The difference isn't really about the darkness itself, it's about expectation and ownership. A blink is self-generated, and more than that, it's self-generated in a way the brain has practiced, quite literally, tens of thousands of times a day since infancy. There's a kind of internal paperwork that gets filed the instant before the eyelids close, a signal sent out that essentially says, "This closure is coming, it's mine, don't be alarmed." That signal, sometimes described by researchers as an efference copy, a kind of internal carbon copy of the motor command, travels alongside the instruction to the eyelid muscles and arrives at the visual and attentional centers just ahead of the darkness itself. It's a bit like a stagehand quietly telling the rest of the crew, "I'm about to dim the lights for a second, don't worry," before actually reaching for the switch. Because the warning arrived first, nobody backstage treats the dimming as an emergency. An unexpected flicker, on the other hand, carries no such warning. There was no internal memo. The darkness simply arrives, uninvited, and because the brain never got the chance to file it under ordinary, self-caused, and expected, it gets filed instead under something worth checking.
This is the same reasoning, at bottom,
that explains why you can tickle almost anyone else far more effectively than you can tickle yourself. Your own touch comes with its own advance notice, its own efference copy, dampening the sensation before it even fully arrives. Someone else's touch carries no such warning, and so it lands with its full, surprising force. The blink and the external flicker work on the very same principle, just applied to sight instead of touch. One comes pre-announced, the other doesn't. This also helps explain why it's not simply the length of the darkness that determines whether you notice it, but rather whether the darkness matches what was expected, given who or what caused it. A blink lasting a third of a second disappears completely. But if you're reading something on a screen and the screen itself goes black for even a tenth of that time, an interruption far shorter than any ordinary blink, you'll almost certainly catch it, because nothing about that gap was pre-filed as yours.
It arrived as a foreign event, an unpredicted change, and the same coarse, ever-running comparison system we talked about earlier, the one constantly checking the gist of the world against what it expected to find, immediately flags the mismatch and pulls your attention toward it, the way a night watchman, dozing lightly through a quiet, familiar shift, snaps fully awake not because of loudness exactly, but because a sound arrived that didn't belong in his mental map of the building's usual creaks and settlings. It's a strangely comforting design. When you sit with it a while, the nervous system isn't spending its limited attention indiscriminately. treating every dimming of the world as equally worthy of concern. It has learned, over a lifetime of blinking, breathing, and moving through familiar rooms, which interruptions are its own doing and which ones might mean something. Your own blinks, having been rehearsed so many hundreds of thousands of times, are filed away as background noise, no more alarming than the small motion of your own breath. It's only the darkness that arrives without warning, without a plausible, expected cause, that gets pulled up into awareness and given a name. And as your body settles further into rest tonight, that same discerning quiet is still doing its work underneath you, letting the expected pass without comment, and reserving its attention only for whatever might genuinely be worth waking up for. There are, it turns out, several different kinds of blinking, and they don't come from the same place in the brain, don't move at the same speed, and don't mean the same thing, even though from the outside they all look like the same small flutter of the eyelids. Learning to tell them apart doesn't require any effort on your part right now. It's simply worth knowing, the way it's worth knowing, that not every closed door in a house was closed for the same reason, as you lie here letting your own eyes do whatever they're doing without your supervision. The most common kind, by far, is the spontaneous blink, the one we've been talking about for most of this narration. It isn't triggered by anything happening to your eye in that particular moment. No speck of dust, no gust of wind, no sudden brightness. It's generated from deep within the brain, in circuits tied to a chemical messenger called dopamine, on a rhythm that's more like breathing than like reacting. You don't decide to have one, and you don't need a reason. It simply arrives, roughly every 4 seconds on average when you're awake and unoccupied, though that number moves around enormously depending on what you're doing, which is really the heart of what this section is about. Then there's the voluntary blink, which is a different animal entirely, even though it uses the same muscle, the orbicularis oculi, the ring of fibers circling the eye that pulls the lid down like a drawstring. A voluntary blink is one you choose, consciously, the kind you might do to clear a bit of grit, or the kind an actor learns to control on stage so it reads at the right dramatic moment instead of an inconvenient one. It travels a slightly different path through the nervous system, originating in the same motor cortex that governs any deliberate movement, the way lifting a finger does. It tends to be a touch slower and more deliberate than a spontaneous blink, and interestingly, people are often not very good at doing it convincingly on command, which is part of why old-fashioned lie detection folklore, however unreliable in practice, fixated so heavily on blinking in the first place. A forced blink rarely looks quite like the real thing, in the same way a smile you're asked to perform for a photograph rarely looks quite like the one that arrives on its own. The third kind is the reflex blink, and this one isn't optional at all. It's the fastest of the three, sometimes closing the eye in well under 1/10 of a second, triggered by something touching the cornea, a puff of air, an object moving suddenly toward the face, even a loud, unexpected noise. This is the blink that doesn't wait for permission from anywhere resembling conscious thought. It runs through a short, almost primitive loop, involving the brainstem, bypassing the slower deliberation that ordinary decisions require, because if something is genuinely about to strike your eye, there isn't time for you to think about it first. It's the same category of reflex that makes you flinch from a hot stove before you've registered the word hot. Evolution built this one for speed, not elegance. And then, harder to pin down but very real, there's what researchers sometimes describe as the emotional blink, or blinking tied to affective states,
which behaves less like a single mechanism and more like a shift in the underlying spontaneous rhythm. When you feel a jolt of surprise, or embarrassment, or sudden sadness, blink rate often changes, sometimes a rapid flurry of blinks in the seconds afterward, as though the system needed to reset itself following a spike of internal activity. Nobody watching old newsreel footage from decades of press conferences and public testimony needed a neuroscience degree to notice that people under visible strain often blink more, even if the folk wisdom that grew up around this observation, that a widening blink rate always signals a lie, was always shakier science than the tabloids that repeated it like to admit. What's more defensible is simply this: the emotional and cognitive load a person is carrying seems to leak, in small measurable ways, into how often their eyelids move, even when the person isn't trying to communicate anything at all. What's genuinely striking, once you start comparing these categories, is how differently the spontaneous rate bends under ordinary daily circumstances that have nothing to do with dust or drama. Reading is one of the clearest examples. Ask someone to read silently, and their blink rate drops, sometimes by more than half, compared to when they're simply sitting and gazing at nothing in particular. It isn't that the eyes need less lubrication while reading. It's that the visual system is working hard, tracking each word, each small jump from one cluster of letters to the next, and the brain seems to postpone the blink until it reaches a natural pause, the end of a sentence, a comma, the bottom of a paragraph, almost the way a musician holds a breath until a phrase resolves rather than gasping in the middle of it. Researchers who first noticed this, decades ago, watching subjects with early blink counting apparatus that today looks charmingly primitive, little mechanical counters clicked by hand, while an assistant watched a volunteer's face, found that blinks cluster at these boundaries with a regularity that seems almost punctuational, as though the eyelid were quietly marking the grammar of attention itself. Conversation does something different again. When you're speaking with another person, particularly in an unhurried, comfortable exchange, blink rate tends to rise compared to reading, sometimes climbing well above the ordinary baseline, and it often synchronizes loosely with the rhythm of turn-taking, a small flurry near the end of your own sentence, as though closing a kind of visual parenthesis around your turn to speak. Screens complicate the picture further, and not always in the direction people assume. Staring at a bright display, whether a phone, a laptop, or years ago a television, tends to suppress blinking in a way that resembles reading, sometimes even more severely, because the visual task of parsing changing, high-contrast information at close range keeps the eyes locked in continuous, active sampling. This is why eyes exposed to long stretches of screen time so often feel dry and gritty by the end of the evening, not because the screen itself does anything sinister to the eye, but because the blinking that would normally spread a fresh layer of tears across the surface simply isn't happening as often as the eye's chemistry expects it to. Concentration in general, regardless of what's producing it, tends to have this suppressing effect. Threading a needle, parallel parking in a tight space, solving a puzzle that demands close visual attention, all of these push blink rate down, sometimes dramatically, as the brain prioritizes an unbroken stream of visual information over its usual maintenance schedule.
Fatigue moves in the opposite direction and does something a little more chaotic. Tired eyes tend to blink more often, but also, oddly, sometimes more slowly and less completely, a partial, sluggish closure that doesn't quite finish the job, which is part of why extreme tiredness can leave the eyes feeling both overused and under-moistened at once, a strange combination that most people have felt without ever having a name for it. Stress behaves unpredictably too, sometimes raising blink rate the way emotional spikes do, sometimes suppressing it if the stress is tied to intense focus. the eyes locked wide during a moment of alarm, the way an animal freezes rather than flinches when startled badly enough. Dry air changes the equation from an entirely different angle, one that has nothing to do with the brain's scheduling and everything to do with simple physics. In low humidity, whether from winter heating, an airplane cabin, or a dry climate, tears evaporate faster from the surface of the eye between blinks, so the same spontaneous blinking rhythm that felt perfectly sufficient in a humid room can start to feel inadequate in a dry one, the eye drying out faster than its usual maintenance cycle accounts for. And then there's something subtler still, a kind of social choreography to blinking that most people have never consciously noticed, but that turns out to be measurable. People sitting together in conversation, or an audience watching a single speaker, tend to drift, faintly, toward blinking at overlapping moments, not because anyone is imitating anyone on purpose, but because shared attention naturally produces shared pauses, and pauses are where blinks like to live. None of this variation means anything is wrong with any particular blink or any particular rhythm on any particular night or day. It simply means the eyelid is far more responsive to the texture of a moment than its plain, mechanical appearance would suggest, speeding up, slowing down, clustering, and scattering according to whether you're reading, talking, staring at a screen, threading a needle, feeling something sudden, or simply breathing the dry air of a heated room in December. And as your own blink rate settles now into whatever slow, formless pattern belongs to the edge of sleep, it's worth turning to what that particular rhythm looks like, the one that appears only in the last stretch, before the eyes stop blinking altogether and close for the night. A newborn, it turns out, barely blinks at all. In the first weeks of life, an infant might blink only once or twice a minute, a fraction of the adult rate, and for a long time, researchers weren't entirely sure why, since the eye's basic anatomy is already in place at birth. The same tear film, the same lubricating glands, the same soft sweep of the lid across the cornea. One idea that has gathered support over the years is that spontaneous blinking is tied less to the eye's raw physical need for moisture and more to the maturity of the dopamine pathways in the brain that govern the whole rhythm, the same background scheduling system described earlier in this narration. Those pathways are still under construction in a newborn, still laying down their wiring, and so the blink rate climbs gradually across childhood, not in a smooth line, but in a slow, uneven ascent, until it settles somewhere near the adult range by the time a child reaches their teenage years. A parent watching an infant's wide, steady, unblinking gaze might read into it all sorts of things, an intensity of attention, a kind of unblinking wonder at the world, and while that reading isn't wrong exactly, the more mundane explanation is simply that the machinery for pacing blinks hasn't finished assembling itself yet. The eye of an infant still stays wet enough between those rare blinks, in part because young eyes tend to sit slightly more open at rest and produce tears efficiently, and in part because infants spend enormous stretches of time asleep to begin with, which removes the need for waking maintenance blinks during those hours entirely. At the other end of a life, the pattern shifts again, though less dramatically and less uniformly. Blink rate doesn't have a single clean trajectory with age, the way, say, height does, rising and then plateauing in a predictable curve. Instead, aging changes several of the underlying pieces at once, and they don't always pull in the same direction. The glands that produce the oily layer of the tear film, the layer that keeps water from evaporating too quickly, tend to become less efficient over the decades, a gradual narrowing and thickening of their output that makes the tear film less stable than it once was. This alone might be expected to push blink rate upward, the eye compensating for faster evaporation, the same way it does in a dry room. And in some older adults that does seem to happen. But aging also brings changes to the same basal ganglia circuitry that governs the dopamine-linked pacing of blinks in the first place, and in some people, that circuitry becomes less active rather than more, which can push the rate the other way. The result, across large groups of older adults, is not a single clear trend, but a wider spread, some blinking more than they did at 40, some blinking less, the tidy bell curve of a younger population growing flatter and more spread out with age. This is one of those places where it would be easy to overstate the science, to draw a confident line from blink rate directly to brain health, and it's worth resisting that urge, because the honest picture is messier, a rough correlation buried inside a great deal of individual variation, useful to researchers studying populations, but not something any single person should read too much into from their own mirror. Sleepiness itself, quite apart from age, produces a blink signature that sleep researchers have learned to watch for with real precision, because unlike a felt sense of tiredness, which people are notoriously bad at reporting accurately about themselves, the eyelid doesn't lie in quite the same way. As a person grows drowsy, three things tend to happen to their blinks, often before the person has any subjective sense that sleep is close. The blinks themselves get slower, not more frequent necessarily, but slower in their execution, the downstroke and the upstroke both lengthening, so a blink that might take 1/10 of a second in an alert person can stretch out closer to half a second in a very drowsy one, giving the whole movement a heavier, more deliberate quality, the eyelid moving like a curtain being lowered by a tired hand instead of released by a quick one. Second, the eyes stay closed slightly longer at the bottom of each blink, a small pause that lengthens as drowsiness deepens, sometimes called the closure duration, and this pause is one of the more reliable early warnings researchers use in drowsy driving studies, because it lengthens well before a driver's head starts to nod. And third, blinks begin clustering into slow rolling waves rather than scattering steadily across a minute, with the eyes sometimes staying open for an unusually long stretch and then producing several closely spaced blinks in a row, as though the system were catching up on delayed maintenance all at once. Engineers who study driver fatigue have built entire monitoring systems around exactly these three signatures, cameras trained on the eyes rather than the road, because the eyelid, moving slower and staying shut a beat longer, tends to announce the approach of sleep before almost anything else about a person's outward behavior does. Contact lenses introduce their own small, practical wrinkle into all of this, one that has nothing to do with drowsiness or age and everything to do with simple friction and coverage. A lens sits directly on the tear film, which changes both how quickly that film breaks up and how the lid interacts with the eye's surface on each pass, and many contact lens wearers find, especially in the early weeks of adjusting to lenses, that their blink rate rises somewhat, the eye behaving as though it senses the tear film needs restocking more frequently than it did with bare cornea. Some studies have also found that contact lens wearers, and particularly people who wear lenses for many hours during screen-heavy days, show a higher rate of incomplete blinks, blinks where the upper lid doesn't quite make it all the way down to meet the lower lid before reversing, leaving a thin band of the cornea, usually along the bottom, without full contact and full re-wetting. This incomplete blink pattern isn't unique to lens wearers,
It happens to plenty of people simply from staring hard at close screens, but lenses seem to make the consequences of an incomplete blink more noticeable sooner, since the lens itself needs the same rewetting the eye does, and a partial blink leaves both underserviced at once. There are also a handful of neurological conditions in which blink patterns change in ways doctors have learned to watch for, though this is worth approaching gently and without turning it into a checklist for self-diagnosis, since an unusual blink rate on its own, noticed by an amateur observer in a mirror, means very little in isolation. In some movement disorders that affect the basal ganglia, the same deep brain structures tied to that background dopamine rhythm mentioned earlier, blink rate can drop rather noticeably, part of a broader reduction in spontaneous, unconscious movement that also shows up in reduced arm swing while walking or a quieter, less animated face at rest. In other conditions, the opposite occurs. Blinking becomes more frequent or takes on an almost tic-like quality, sometimes intertwined with other small repeated movements. None of this is offered as a diagnostic guide, and a single evening of extra blinking or a single week of feeling like your eyes aren't blinking quite as often as usual is far more likely to reflect stress, dry air, screen time, or simple daily variation than anything a neurologist would ever need to see. What these conditions demonstrate, at the level of this particular exploration, is simply how deeply blinking is wired into the same basal ganglia circuitry that governs so much of the body's quiet background choreography, walking, facial expression, the small unconscious adjustments of posture that happen without anyone deciding to make them.
Blinking sits in that same family of automatic movement, close enough to it that a change in the pacing system can show up first, sometimes years before other symptoms, as nothing more dramatic than a slightly different blink rate that only a specialist with the right equipment would ever think to measure. Taken together, all of this variation across a lifetime, across a single day's fatigue, across a lens-wearing afternoon, paints a picture of a control system that is neither purely mechanical nor purely voluntary, but something continuously adjusted, moment by moment, by information the conscious mind never directly receives. And it's that same quiet, adaptive system, still running now, still adjusting on your behalf, without asking your permission, that eventually eases into the particular slow pattern it produces only at the threshold of sleep itself. Let's turn now to how anyone figured this out in the first place, because darkness that isn't noticed is a strange thing to study. You can't ask a person to report an absence, not reliably, since the whole point of the phenomenon is that the absence never reaches the part of them that reports things. Researchers had to get clever, and the cleverness itself is worth sitting with for a while, the way you might sit with a good piece of engineering, appreciating the problem before appreciating the solution. The earliest useful approach was almost embarrassingly simple, at least in concept, even if the execution took real patience. If you want to know whether a blink actually blocks visual information, you present something to the eye during the blink and see whether it registers, not before, not after, but precisely during, which meant researchers needed a way to know exactly when a blink was happening, down to fractions of a second, and a way to fire a stimulus into that narrow window with matching precision. This is not something you can do by watching someone's face and pressing a button. Human reaction time alone would ruin the timing. So the work depended on instruments that could track the eyelid directly, often using a small reflective marker or a beam of infrared light bounced off the surface of the eye, feeding into equipment that could detect the exact moment of closure and trigger a flash of light within milliseconds. Picture the setup. A person sits with their head gently stabilized, chin resting in a padded cradle, forehead against a bar, the unglamorous furniture of visual science that hasn't changed much in 100 years. In front of them, a screen or a small light source, wired to their face or aimed at their eye, a sensor watching for the telltale signal of the lid beginning to drop. The experimenters aren't interested in whether the person notices a flash shown while their eyes are open. That much was never in question. They want to know what happens when the flash is timed to land during the blink itself, hidden inside that 100 to 200 millisecond window of mechanical darkness. And the finding, replicated across various versions of this design, was that flashes delivered during a blink were reported far less reliably than flashes of identical brightness delivered just outside it, even when the physical eye was closed for only a fraction of the flash's duration, even when, on paper, enough light might have theoretically leaked through the thin skin of the lid to be detectable by a very sensitive instrument. The suppression was doing more work than the lid alone could explain. That last detail is really the heart of the whole discovery, so it's worth slowing down on it. If blink blindness were purely mechanical, a simple matter of a shutter closing over a lens, then a bright enough flash should still get through, the way a strong flashlight beam can still be seen faintly through closed eyelids in a dark room. Everyone has experienced that on some sleepy night. But the experiments kept showing detection rates that fell further than physical blocking alone could account for, especially right around the moments just before the lid fully closed and just after it began to reopen, moments when a meaningful amount of light was still physically reaching the retina. Something beyond the eyelid was suppressing perception. That's the observation that pushed researchers to stop thinking of the blink as a simple physical curtain and start looking for a neural signal running in parallel with it. Eye tracking technology matured a great deal over the decades this work was conducted, moving from bulky contact lenses fitted with tiny mirrors, genuinely uncomfortable devices that early volunteers wore for the sake of scientific curiosity, toward the gentler infrared corneal reflection systems used today, the same basic technology, quieter and smaller now, that shows up in some consumer eye-tracking devices and accessibility tools. But whatever the era, the logic stayed consistent. Know precisely when the eye closes, know precisely when a stimulus arrives, and compare what people notice in each condition. It's the same basic experimental structure you'd use to test a heartbeat's effect on hearing, or a swallow's effect on taste, timing a brief interruption in one internal process against how well another kind of information gets through. Once flash detection experiments had established that something extra was happening, the next question was naturally, where in the brain that something extra was coming from. This is where electroencephalography enters the story, the technology of recording electrical activity from the scalp using an array of small sensors, each one picking up the faint, aggregated electrical hum of thousands of neurons firing together underneath it. An EEG cap looks a little like a swim cap, dotted with wired discs, and wearing one for one of these studies mostly involves sitting very still in a dim room while researchers ask you to blink normally or to look at a screen that occasionally flickers. Nothing painful or invasive, just a slow, patient recording of the brain's own electrical weather. What EEG studies found was that blinking is accompanied by a distinct pattern of activity in visual areas of the brain, changes that don't simply mirror the loss of light hitting the retina. If the brain's visual cortex were only responding to less light coming in, you'd expect its activity to look roughly like what happens when a room is briefly dimmed by an external hand, a gradual, passive quieting. Instead, the recorded activity around blinks showed features that looked more like an active adjustment, a shift in the pattern of firing that seemed to be doing something rather than merely receiving less. Researchers describing this work often reach for comparisons to noise cancellation, an actively generated countersignal rather than a passive muffling, though it's worth holding that comparison loosely, since the brain's version of cancellation is a good deal messier and less precise than the tidy electronics in a pair of headphones. Brain imaging added another layer to this picture, using functional magnetic resonance imaging to look at blood flow patterns as a proxy for neural activity across broader stretches of the brain, rather than just the surface signals EEG can pick up. Lying inside an MRI scanner is its own particular experience. The loud, rhythmic knocking of the machine, the stillness required, a mirror sometimes angled above the face so a person can watch a screen without lifting their head. Studies using this method during natural blinking found something that surprised many of the researchers involved. Certain areas associated with attention and awareness showed a brief dip in activity right around the moment of a blink, a dip that again didn't match what happened when the same darkness was produced by an external dimming of the room instead of an eyelid closing. The brain, it seemed, was doing something with blinks that it didn't bother doing with equivalent external darkness, treating a self-generated visual gap differently from a passively received one. That comparison between eyelid darkness and matched external darkness became one of the cleverest tools in this whole area of study, and it's worth understanding exactly how it works, because it's what lets researchers separate two explanations that would otherwise be tangled together. If you simply compare a blink to nothing at all, you can't tell whether any effect you observe comes from the brain actively suppressing perception or just from the ordinary consequence of losing light for 1/10 of a second. So experimenters built displays that could dim or briefly blank the screen for a duration and timing that exactly matched a person's natural blink, without the person actually blinking, sometimes using the same eye-tracking setup to trigger the dimming based on the rhythm of that individual's own blinks recorded earlier. Then they compared perception during a real blink to perception during this artificial, external, precisely matched twin of a blink. Any leftover difference between the two conditions, after accounting for the shared loss of light, could reasonably be attributed to something the brain does specifically in response to its own self-generated closures. Across many versions of this comparison, a leftover difference kept showing up, smaller in some tasks than others, but present often enough to be taken seriously. There's also a much older, humbler method that predates all of this equipment and still turns up in classroom demonstrations, sometimes credited to observations going back well over a century, involving nothing more than a person and a mirror. Try, right now if you like, or simply picture it, to watch your own eyes blink in a mirror. It's remarkably difficult to catch the moment itself, even though you know precisely when you're doing it, even though you can feel your own eyelids moving. Onlookers watching someone else blink have no trouble seeing it happen. It's only the blinker's own view of their own blink, reflected back at them, that seems to vanish from awareness at the exact instant it occurs. A small, unsettling, perfectly repeatable little demonstration that anyone can perform in their own bathroom, long before there was ever a laboratory involved. Once you know the brain can quietly paper over its own blackouts, you start noticing how much of the modern visual world depends on that same trick, sometimes borrowing it deliberately, sometimes fighting against it, sometimes simply hoping it will show up and rescue an illusion that would otherwise fall apart. Take cinema first, since it's the oldest, and in some ways the most direct descendant of the blink problem. A movie is not, despite how it feels, a smooth flow of continuous motion. It's a rapid sequence of still photographs, typically 24 of them every second, each one a frozen instant, with nothing at all happening in the gaps between frames. Between each still image and the next, the projector, in the old mechanical days, would actually block the light entirely, spinning a shutter blade across the beam so the screen went briefly dark, then briefly dark again, sometimes twice or 3 times per frame, just to push the flicker rate high enough that the eye would stop noticing it as flicker at all. So a person sitting in a theater watching a film is, technically, watching a rapid alternation of image and blackness, dozens of times each second, and yet what they experience is a continuous, fluid world of motion, faces, weather, chases, tears. The visual system is doing something structurally similar to what it does across a blink, smoothing over the gaps, filling the missing intervals with an assumption of continuity rather than registering each blackout as a blackout. Filmmakers didn't need to understand the neuroscience to exploit it. They only needed to notice, through trial and error over the first few decades of cinema, that if you show enough still images quickly enough, audiences stop seeing stillness and start seeing motion, and if you flicker the light fast enough, audiences stop seeing the flicker at all. Editors go further still, and this is where the analogy to blinking gets almost eerie. A cut in a film, an abrupt jump from one camera angle to a completely different one, is in some ways a manufactured blink, a deliberate gap in continuous visual information that the editor is gambling the audience won't experience as a gap. Early filmmakers worried enormously about this. Would viewers be confused, even nauseated, by a shot that jumped instantly from a wide view of a room to a close view of a hand on a doorknob? It turned out audiences adapted almost immediately, the same way an infant's brain adapts to the disappearing world behind its own blinking eyelids, stitching one shot to the next into a single ongoing scene, rather than experiencing each cut as a small, violent interruption. There's a technique editors still study today, informally called cutting on action, where a cut is hidden inside a moment of movement, timed to a door swinging shut or a person turning their head, precisely because the brain's attention is already occupied by that motion and is less likely to register the seam where one shot ends and another begins. It's not identical to what happens across a blink, since the visual system isn't suppressing its own perception the way it seems to during self-generated eyelid closures, but the underlying opportunity is closely related. Attention has limited bandwidth, and gaps placed where attention is already busy elsewhere tend to vanish more easily than gaps placed in a moment of quiet, undivided watching. Virtual reality designers ran into a version of this same puzzle from the opposite direction, as a problem to be managed rather than a trick to be exploited. In VR, unlike in a movie theater, the images are not being fed to a stationary viewer sitting still in a chair. The screen is strapped to a moving head, and if there's ever a delay between when a person turns their head and when the image on the display catches up to match that turn,
The mismatch can produce a queasy, disorienting sensation, something like a mild seasickness that engineers now simply call simulator sickness. It turns out, one of the times these systems can quietly slip, in a correction, adjusting the frame, or compensating for a dropped moment of tracking data, is during a blink, precisely because that's when the visual system is least likely to notice anything happening. A researcher recording eye movements during VR testing can watch, on a separate monitor, the exact interval when a blink occurs, and that interval becomes a small window of opportunity, a few tens of milliseconds during which the system can do a bit of invisible housekeeping without the wearer perceiving any hiccup at all. It's not so different, in spirit, from a stagehand who's learned to rearrange furniture only while the curtain happens to be down. Cameras themselves raise a related but distinct question, closer to photography than to any of this perceptual smoothing. Anyone who has tried to take a group photograph knows the frustration of the shutter clicking at the exact instant someone blinks, producing a picture with one person's eyes closed while everyone else looks perfectly alert. This has nothing to do with the brain suppressing anything. It's a purely mechanical coincidence, the sensor capturing a single frozen instant of time, and if that instant happens to fall within someone's blink, which lasts roughly 1/10 to 1/3 of a second, then the picture simply shows what was physically true of that person's eyelids at that moment.
Modern cameras and phones have started building in a modest defense against this, capturing a short burst of frames around the moment the shutter is pressed, and then quietly selecting the one where everyone's eyes happen to be open, or sometimes offering to swap in an open-eyed version of a face from an adjacent frame. It's a mechanical patch for a problem that has existed since the earliest days of portrait photography, when sitting for a picture could take a full minute or more, and blinking wasn't even the main concern, since almost any small movement would blur the image entirely. Driving offers a much higher stakes version of the same underlying arithmetic, since here, the missing visual information isn't a curiosity, it's a genuine hazard. A person blinking while driving at highway speed will, during that fraction of a second, travel some meaningful distance with no direct visual sampling of the road ahead, and unlike watching a film or glancing in a mirror, there's no forgiving audience for a mistake made during that gap. This is part of why fatigue is so dangerous behind the wheel. A well-rested driver blinks briefly and predictably, and the brain's usual bridging mechanisms, along with a driver's ongoing model of where the road and other vehicles are likely to be, cover the gap without incident almost every time. A sufficiently tired driver, though, can slip into something closer to an actual involuntary closure of the eyes for a second or more, sometimes called a microsleep, which is an entirely different category of event from an ordinary blink, and one the brain's blink-bridging machinery was never built to paper over safely. Some newer vehicles now include cameras aimed at the driver's face specifically to measure blink duration and eyelid drooping, on the theory that a blink stretching unusually long or blinks becoming unusually frequent is one of the more reliable early warnings that a person is drifting toward that dangerous, unintended kind of gap. Athletes and their opponents have their own quiet negotiation with blink timing, one that mostly plays out below the level of conscious strategy. A batter facing a fast pitch, a goalkeeper
watching a penalty kick, a tennis player returning a serve. All of them are working with reaction windows measured in a few hundred milliseconds, intervals not enormously longer than a blink itself. There's some evidence, still being refined by researchers who study elite performers, that skilled athletes in certain fast sports show patterns of blinking that cluster at moments when the outcome of a play has, in effect, already been decided, rather than during the critical window when the ball's trajectory is still being resolved, as though years of practice have nudged their blink timing toward the safest possible moments, without any conscious awareness that this adjustment is happening at all. It's a modest, unglamorous kind of expertise, invisible to spectators, and probably invisible to the athletes themselves, and it fits neatly alongside everything else this story has touched on. Another example of a system tuning itself, without instruction, to keep the gaps from landing anywhere that matters. Animals complicate the picture further, and in illuminating ways, because not every creature blinks the way humans do, and the differences hint at how much of this bridging behavior is a general solution to a general problem, rather than something unique to primates.
Birds, for instance, mostly rely on a nictitating membrane, a thin, translucent third eyelid that sweeps across the eye horizontally rather than vertically, and it moves so quickly and so often stays at least partly transparent while it moves that many birds never fully lose their view of the world the way a human does with each blink. An owl swiveling its head to track a sound, a pigeon walking across a plaza, a hawk holding its gaze on something moving far below. All of them are managing something closer to a dimmer switch than an on-off switch, a brief softening of the image rather than a true blackout. Some reptiles skip the mechanism almost entirely, relying instead on a fixed, transparent scale that never needs wiping, which is part of why a lizard's stare can feel so unblinking and strange to a human watching it, so unlike the rhythm we expect from another set of eyes. And it raises a question that nobody watching a lizard usually stops to ask, which is why humans ended up with the more disruptive version at all, a full mechanical shutter instead of a gentler membrane, when other lineages found ways to keep the lubrication and the debris clearing without paying nearly as steep a visual price. Part of the answer seems to be a matter of trade-offs that were never optimized for cinema-smooth vision in the first place, because evolution rarely optimizes for any single thing in isolation. The particular architecture of the human eyelid, with its opaque skin and its fast, forceful closure, may simply have been the arrangement that best served everything else the eye and its surrounding tissue needed to do, protecting the cornea from injury, spreading tear film efficiently, responding quickly to sudden threats like a foreign object or a puff of wind, and none of the pressures shaping that arrangement had much to do with whether the resulting gaps in vision would be noticeable. The brain's bridging machinery, then, starts to look less like a feature that was designed and more like a patch that became necessary after the fact, a downstream fix for an eyelid that had already been settled by other, older priorities. It's a reminder that so much of what feels elegant about a working body is really a series of adequate solutions to earlier problems, stacked on top of one another, with the more recent layers quietly cleaning up after the older ones. Nothing about that lineage was aiming for continuity of experience. Continuity just turned out to be something worth arranging afterward, once a nervous system existed that was capable of caring whether the world seemed to flicker. Which brings the story, gently, toward its more uncertain edges,
the places where the science stops being tidy and starts asking questions nobody has fully answered yet. Because underneath all of this, underneath the timing studies and the perceptual bridging and the saccadic suppression, sits a much older and much harder puzzle, one that blinking merely happens to illustrate rather than solve. That puzzle is whether conscious experience is actually continuous at all, or whether what feels like an unbroken stream of awareness is itself a kind of construction, assembled after the fact from fragments, the way a blink's missing 80 milliseconds gets quietly filled in without ever being noticed. Some researchers who study attention and consciousness have wondered, in different ways and across different frameworks, whether the sense of a smooth, ongoing now is less like a continuous recording and more like a series of snapshots, stitched together so seamlessly that the seams themselves become impossible to detect from the inside. If that were true, then blinking wouldn't be a strange exception to an otherwise unbroken experience. It would just be one especially clear example of something that happens, in smaller and less noticeable ways, all the time. This isn't a settled matter, and it would be a mistake to treat it as one. Some scientists, studying attention, describe brief lapses called attentional blinks, moments after processing one piece of information, where the system is measurably slower to register a second one, arriving close behind it, even with the eyes wide open, and nothing physically obstructing the view. Others study the gaps that occur during rapid eye movements themselves, the saccades that jump the eyes from one point to another, dozens of times a minute, each jump accompanied by a brief suppression of visual processing, not unlike the one that happens during a blink, so that the world doesn't appear to smear as the gaze darts around a room. Still others study the boundaries of working memory, and how much of what a person seems to be aware of, moment to moment, may only be a kind of standing readiness to notice something, rather than a full, rich, continuously rendered picture held in mind at all times. None of these lines of research agree on a single tidy theory of what consciousness is doing between one instant and the next. Some researchers lean toward viewing awareness as fundamentally continuous, with these gaps as minor, well-patched interruptions in an otherwise steady stream. Others lean toward viewing it as fundamentally discontinuous, a rapid sequence of discrete moments that only appears smooth, because there's no vantage point from which to notice the cuts. The honest answer, for now, is that no one knows for certain, and the people who study this most closely tend to be the ones most careful about saying so. There's something worth sitting with in that uncertainty, rather than rushing past it toward a comforting conclusion either way. It would be easy to end a story like this by declaring that the brain is a masterful editor, stitching together a flawless illusion of continuity, or by declaring instead that the self was never continuous to begin with, and that this whole sense of an unbroken thread has been a kind of pleasant misunderstanding all along. But both of those framings claim more certainty than the evidence actually supports. What the evidence does support, more modestly, is that the boundary between one moment of experience and the next is far blurrier than it feels, and that a great deal of what a person calls the present moment is already, by the time it's noticed, something slightly reconstructed, slightly smoothed, slightly after the fact. Whether that reconstruction happens over gaps that are truly empty, or over gaps that are simply too brief and too well covered to register as gaps, may not even be a question with a single correct answer, so much as a question about what continuity itself really means for a system built the way a nervous system is built. And maybe that's a strange place to arrive at, so close to the edge of sleep, at the end of a long, unspooling story about blinking. But it isn't an unsettling one, not really, if you let it sit rather than trying to resolve it. Because whatever is true about the deeper architecture of awareness, the plain fact remains that thousands of tiny absences happen to every sighted person every single day, quietly, automatically, without incident, and the world keeps arriving on the other side of each one, exactly where it was left. A room doesn't need to be watched continuously to stay furnished the way you remember it. A conversation doesn't need every syllable witnessed to be followed and understood. A face across a table doesn't flicker out of existence and require rebuilding 40 times a minute just because your eyes closed briefly, 40 separate times, without your permission or your notice. Whatever is happening underneath, whatever the ultimate truth turns out to be, about whether experience is a stream or a series of very well-joined moments, the practical, felt reality is one of astonishing, ordinary stability. Continuity, or something so close to it that the difference has never once mattered to you, has been running quietly in the background of your entire life, unnoticed, unthanked, and entirely dependable. So as you lie here now, on the edge of a much longer and much deeper kind of gap than any blink could ever produce, there's no need to hold vigilance over the transition, no need to watch yourself for the seams. The same machinery that has spent your whole life smoothing over thousands of tiny departures, blinks and saccades and moments of drifting attention alike, doesn't need supervision to keep doing its quiet work. It was never watched during the day, and it doesn't need to be watched now. The dark you're about to enter isn't a gap that needs bridging by anyone, least of all by you. It's simply where the story stops needing to be followed at all. Rest well.